viewers, and welcome to the 31st lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. We have concluded our discussion of T.S. Eliot, and we will now move chronologically further along the 20th century, looking at the lives and works of other iconic and influential writers. After T.S. Eliot, we will turn our attention to a writer who occupies, in some ways, the opposite end of the spectrum, intellectually speaking, creatively speaking, and socially speaking. The name of this poet is W.H. Auden, the full name Weston Hugh Auden, and his dates are 1907 to 1973. As you can see from the dates, Auden occupied the 20th century's most tumultuous years, lived through some of the most important and formative events of the century, much like Eliot. Other than this chronological overlap, however, the two poets are very different. In fact, it would be harder to imagine poets who occupy such an important position in the English literary canon and yet be so different from each other. I'll first spend some time trying to explain why I'm saying that these two poets are very different from each other. That will occupy the majority of this lecture, and if time allows, I will also spend some time in this lecture reading and trying to get a sense of Auden's style and his whole style of composing poetry from a very iconic poem. But first, the differences between Eliot and Auden. The first major difference that we must pay attention to is the way the poet arranges a relationship between three important parts, three important sets of ideas almost. What are these? The first is the figure of the poet, the source of the speaking voice in the poems. The source of the speaking voice is often called the poetic persona or the narrator. It is important to note that this figure is not the biological or biographical figure of the poet, whose name appears in print as the author of the words. This figure is also not completely removed from that figure of the author. This figure is a composite of many different parts of the actual biological author, and yet it is also in some ways the product of ambition, desire, and a great deal of projection on the part of the actual person. This figure relates in very important ways to two other things. The first is society, or the world in which the poet lives, the world in which this persona lives, the world in which the poet's readers live, the world construed in these sociological but also intellectual terms. This is the second figure. The third is tradition. Tradition can be understood as everything that has been written and that has been read in the same vein as the work of poetry under discussion at the moment. Every poem enacts a relationship between these three figures. And the first and the most important difference between Eliot and Auden is the way that this relationship between these three figures is enacted in the poems by these two poets. I'll briefly recall, for the benefit of learners, how this relationship is enacted in the work of T.S. Eliot. At least in the early stages, and we have seen both early and late Eliot, at least in the early stages in the work of T.S. Eliot, the poet establishes his credentials through an Olympian erudition and the sublimation of the great tradition of European literature into his consciousness and writing style. So this is important. As Eliot laid out in the essay Tradition and the Individual Talent, The first condition, although by no means the only condition, but the first minimal condition for the aspiration or the semblance of a poetic career to exist, was the requirement that the poet read, consume the whole European tradition of literature, and find a unique interpretive position in relation to that tradition. This is the first condition, not the only condition, and not a guarantee by any means of success, but it was the first condition. Now, in addition to this, in the work of T.S. Eliot, we also find a great dissatisfaction with the world in which the writer, the poetic persona, and his readers found themselves. What was this world? The figure T.S. Eliot, the biographical writer T.S. Eliot, as well as his many poetic personae, they were quite dissatisfied with many aspects of the world in which they found themselves. These aspects may be briefly enumerated. It has to do a lot with unchecked imperial expansion, that is, the occupation of territories outside Europe, mostly spaces in Africa and Asia, but also Latin America. The unchecked occupation of these areas, the unchecked exploitation and extraction of resources from these areas, the unchecked abuse and violence inflicted on the residents or the human beings who lived in these areas. And all of this without any moral critique of the injustice or the inequality inherent in these actions. This was a reality. Every sensible and aware person living in Europe knew that imperialism was a reality. And yet there lacked, or there wasn't a very strong moral critique of this practice. Even though writers like T.S. Eliot did not feel very strongly or consciously that imperialism was wrong, or that somehow they were implicated in the violence of it, or that somehow they were morally deficient because they had allowed it to happen. This was not an articulate or conscious thought. Nonetheless, the knowledge of imperialism and the lack of a moral critique of it exerted a very corrosive influence on the intellectual and cultural climate of early 20th century Europe. In addition to this, the fact of imperialism, the lack of its critique, there were also other developments which led to the isolation of the poet. There were two devastating wars, the First and the Second World Wars, and as if this weren't enough, there was also economic recession between these two wars. These social developments contributed to the isolation of the poet. Isolation of the poet because the poet believed that these things were wrong, and yet failed to align himself with the dominant ways of thinking in his society. In addition to this, there was also the theory of creative development and the relationship between personality and poetic composition that Eliot had composed for himself, and which we can see articulated in several non-fictional prose pieces of criticism in the early 20th century. Tradition and the individual talent is one, but so is the metaphysical poets, as well as Hamlet and its problems, and so on. Now, the result of all of these acts of critical thinking is that in his poetic writing, Eliot posited a particular encounter between the poet, tradition, and the society in which the poet lived, and which expected from the poet some relief, some sort of consolation and explanation to make tolerable the difficult or unbearable times in which they found themselves. These three aspects, these are the three important realities, but also sets of ideas and also intellectual traditions. These three found themselves in a very particular alignment in the work of Eliot. And what is that alignment? The poet disagrees with the motivations of the society around him. The poet is dismayed by the ravages of war and capitalism around him, and in this state finds that the traditional poetic forms fail to offer an explanatory purchase on the world around him. This is important to note, and also important is the causal link between these three realities or these three events. The condition of the world, the isolation of the poet from the world, these two things together demand that the poet treats some traditional forms of poetry in an ironic manner. When I say ironic, I mean that the poet's relationship to the tradition is mixed. On one hand, the poet acknowledges that they no longer have any power to convey the truths that the world, in its current context, has forced civilized societies to educate themselves in. This is the first part of the poet's relationship to traditional forms of poetry, which I am calling ironic. This is not enough to make that relationship ironic, but this is the first preliminary and fundamental condition. A skepticism about the power that older forms of writing poetry have to convey the truths that are required to be conveyed in the present time. The second part of the relationship between the poet and tradition, which makes the relationship ironic, is that despite the skepticism, the poet also aligns in some ways with these traditional forms. The reason for that is somewhat practical. Despite the skepticism, because these traditional forms are part of a great and powerful European tradition, that is the past, the poet knows that these forms enable his language. This is something that Eliot has articulated repeatedly in many forms. The poet has an almost unconscious knowledge and a feeling for these truths without being able to identify, quantify, or enumerate how this truth occurs. But the poet feels and knows that the history of European literature, and not a selective history, but a very hierarchical history of all the major works in European literature, together speak and make themselves heard through the words that the individual poet writes. Okay, this is one. Further, what complicates or makes the poet somewhat sympathetic towards the tradition is also the fact that some alignment with the tradition is necessary to convince readers that they are in fact reading poetry. Readers of poetry, Eliot knew, can identify and understand a newly published work as a poem only if the poem that they're reading can demonstrate its similarity, its alignment, its dialogue with, and its response to older traditional forms of writing, even though intellectually speaking, the poet is convinced that these are useless. So they may be useless because they cannot convey some fundamental and tragic truths of the 20th century, but they are useful because they help communicate to readers that what is being written and what is being consumed is indeed a work of poetic merit which resembles and continues the tradition of European literature. So we see an ironic invocation of tradition in T.S. Eliot. Now, this entire dynamic, what I just explained, it does not exist in Auden. We cannot find this relationship, this alignment of these three important parts, that is, the poetic persona, the society in which the poet, his readers find themselves in, and the tradition of older European or English literature. This does not occur or exist in Auden. Now, the fact that it does not occur is interesting and it's somewhat surprising because the ingredients of that alignment can be found in Auden's life and work as well. Auden too was dismayed and frustrated by the times in which he lived. And these were more or less the same times as Eliot. So it's not that Auden was somehow naive or blind to the problems of modernity. So why then, despite the skepticism towards modern times, modern society, and modernity in a sociological sense, can we not call Auden a modernist poet in the same way that we must call T.S. Eliot a modernist poet? And it's not just our choice of who to call a modernist and who not to. Auden himself remained quite skeptical in his own voice, in his own writing, in his own times, about the claim to be a modernist. So why not? The first reason we can understand that is by understanding how Auden's attitude towards traditional poetic forms was diametrically opposite to that of Eliot. Unlike Eliot, Auden continued to believe that these forms still had great explanatory power. Sonnets, elegies, but also many other very tightly structured poetic forms. Auden repeatedly and quite prolifically wrote in these forms. Auden was a very skilled practitioner of tightly controlled formal devices. And it stemmed from Auden's belief that these old forms, in the hands of sensitive practitioners, could explain the many contradictions in human nature and in European society, European, American, and the global geopolitical social context, both individual private human nature as well as the complexities of geopolitics of the 20th century. These things could be explained by a perceptive and thoughtful practice of old and traditional poetic forms. This was one. There is another difference between Eliot and Auden. So it's not just that Auden had more faith in traditional forms, whereas Eliot was somehow skeptical. Yes, that is true, that if we look at the evidence on the screen or on the page, we will find if we pick up a book of collected poems or complete poems by Eliot and Auden, we'll find that Auden's complete poems will have more sonnets, will have more recognizable poetic forms, whereas Eliot's complete poems will have a lot of free verse, unrhymed, unmetered verse that follows not a line break or formal organization dictated by convention, but the organization chosen by the poet based on the intellectual and emotional energy of the poem. On the page, this is the evidence. The reason for that, however, is not simply that Auden was naive or had faith in old forms, whereas Eliot was skeptical and intelligent and demanded more from poetic form. No, that's not the case. What appears to be Auden's faith in traditional poetic forms can be understood through a difference in the way these two poets related to history. So this is the second major difference between Eliot and Auden, the way these two poets made space for historical events in their poetic composition. As I mentioned earlier, both lived through the dramatic events of the 20th century. Eliot, being the older poet, lived through all major historical upheavals of the 20th century. Eliot lived through wars, recession, and epidemics. But these events are referred to in Eliot's poems only indirectly. To be able to trace the reality of these events and to be able to find evidence that Eliot was aware of these events, lived through these realities, and wrote while these events were unfolding, it would take a very sharp, almost detective-like gaze. One would have to be hunting for evidence, for clues, to identify words, phrases, and passages that testify to the fact that the poet indeed lived through a time when something major, something written about in history books, something written about in the newspapers and media of the time. This is what we find in Eliot. And one example of that is a very famous sentence picked up only randomly from The Wasteland, the line, "I will show you fear in a handful of dust." The phrase "handful of dust" is taken from Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem Maud, and the sentence conveys the widespread death and destruction left in Europe after World War I. This was also the time that that the influenza pandemic was raging through Europe. So the person who speaks these lines, the narrator or the persona of The Wasteland, is channeling an emotional energy which is motivated by the knowledge of widespread death and destruction. It's important to note how the expression, how the sentence, "I will show you fear in a handful of dust," combines these three things: history, literary tradition, and the poet's own vision. It would be very difficult, if not impossible, to find something comparable, a comparable combination of history, literary tradition, and poetic vision in the work of Auden. It can be found, but these moments are increasing and exceedingly rare. Instead, we find Auden reaching outwards from the inner world of the poet to the public world of newspapers, of war, of politics, to social reality, to find important events, events that changed the world, events that had a consequence for how the 20th century ended up being and feeling. Auden would reach out and incorporate these events. Auden chose to write poems about them. Auden did not write or did not happen to write at a time when important public events took place. Readers of Auden will not have to hunt for evidence that Auden lived through the tumultuous 20th century. Rather, Auden chose to write about important events, poems, and these were not just poems, these were poems with a capital P, meaning they were arrangements of sounds that the least educated English speaker could identify as poems. That is to say, Auden's poems do not require footnotes or require less footnotes and less explanations that would connect the words and sounds of the poem with the mind of Europe. The mind of Europe is a phrase that T.S. Eliot used in the essay Tradition and the Individual Talent. The mind of Europe is key to understanding all of Eliot's writing. In fact, Eliot provided footnotes in the very first edition of The Wasteland, guiding readers to the complexity, the literary dialogues, the intertextuality of his writing. No such guidance is necessary or required in the writing of W.H. Auden. All that is necessary is the ability to read the English language and the ability to appreciate a music and the turn of phrase and the wit and the innovation that a use of the English language produces. So in that sense, Auden's poems are poems that are meant for the general public. They are accessible. Whereas Eliot's are not so much accessible as they are invitations to readers to undertake a somewhat heavy intellectual task and a very demanding, rewarding, but also demanding intellectual task. So this is the second major difference between Eliot and Auden. Some events that are memorialized in Auden's poems are the start of World War II, the Spanish Civil War, and several others. The public relevance of these poems and poetic utterances in them is not tucked away or hiding from the reader, revealing themselves only to the most attentive reader. This is the case in Eliot. In Auden, however, uh, the connection or the poet's involvement in history, the poet's willingness and the poet's desire to embrace history with open arms and to let history into his poetic universe and to be shaped by history, to be guided by history in the writing of poems. That desire, that impulse in Auden is not hidden. It is not uh, allowed only to the most attentive, serious, or suspicious reader. Uh, the poet's relationship to tradition as well as history is open and it is transparent. Auden's poems announce their historical connection from their very titles. Uh, Two examples of such poems are Spain and September 1st, 1939. Spain was written at a time when the Spanish Civil War was raging in Europe, and Auden, like many others, had spent time in the war. Auden was the driver of an ambulance. September 1st, 1939 describes the mood, the intellectual and emotional mood in Europe as the as the Second World War began. Not only did Auden write about important events, he also commemorated the deaths of important figures. His collection, Another Time, which is in some ways the collection, the volume that established Auden's reputation as a major poet of the 20th century, as an indispensable voice of the 20th century, Another Time, has some of the most widely read elegies of the 20th century. These poems, it's no exaggeration to state, are among the best poems of the 20th century period. This is extraordinary and somewhat ridiculous language to be using in an academic lecture, but the poems in this volume, in fact, do merit that kind of superlative language. And these are poems that Auden wrote as elegies for the deaths of famous figures, figures such as William Butler Yeats, Sigmund Freud, among others. We will read these poems in subsequent lectures and understand exactly how Auden's use of the elegy gives Auden such an indispensable and unique place in the history of 20th century poetry. The final difference between these two poets is politics. Eliot was a conservative through and through. Everyone knows that, and we have seen some very powerful evidence of that. We can understand some of Eliot's conservatism from the race and class-based superiority that Eliot might have felt as a result of his American origins, and the urgency Eliot felt, the somewhat paranoid urgency, to assimilate thoroughly into a very hierarchical, rigid, class-based English society and culture. Along with Ezra Pound and William Butler Yeats, Eliot is widely recognized by scholars of modernism as one pole of a uniquely 20th century unholy trinity. That is, poets whose work was characterized by great formal innovation and dreadful, obnoxious politics. Eliot's conservatism came very close to fascism. On the other hand, Auden was on the opposite extreme. From his student days at Oxford, Auden leaned too far to the left, much to the dismay of his own family and some of his friend circles. The arc of Auden's career helps us witness how politics shapes a career in very different ways. The earliest poems that Auden published were very similar to what he had read by T.S. Eliot. In fact, Auden's career as a poet began with the help of T.S. Eliot. His first book book-length volume, the collection of poems titled simply Poems, was published in the year 1930 with the editorial approval of T.S. Eliot, who was the editor of Faber Books. In these poems, composed in the late 1920s, we can see Auden occupying the same poetic persona and stance that we find in Eliot's early works, but with much less accomplishment. Edward Mendelssohn, the scholar, describes this collection as describing a doomed poet looking down on a doomed society. The influence of Eliot was strongest when Auden was a student at Oxford. The child of a middle-class couple from the heavily industrial town of Birmingham in the north of England, Auden was sent to college to secure a stable career, and he hoped to do that, and his parents hoped he would do that by study of science. His father was a physician and his mother a deeply devout Anglican, and the young Whiston was expected to develop in a standard issue British conservative manner. However, he ended up with a radical group of free-thinking writers and poets, and also subsequently changed his stream of study from science to literature. He was part of a group that was later known as the Auden generation, and also known as the Oxford group. This group included Stephen Spender, Cecil Day-Lewis, and Louis MacNeice. While at Oxford, with the help of Spender, Auden first printed a collection of poems privately circulated, also called Poems, in the year 1928. This was different from the volume Poems that would appear in 1930. The latter, as I mentioned earlier, was published by Faber Books with the editorial approval of T.S. Eliot. The former was not strictly speaking a publication. It was more a juvenile expression of poetic intent from a few intelligent and precocious students. I will stop this introductory overview at this point and continue discussing how the influence of Marxism, psychoanalysis, and a general anti-fascist tendency during the later college years of Auden produced the first change in Auden's career, and can be seen very powerfully in the poems that Auden would go on to write in the 1930s. The volume, Another Time, was the culmination of this very powerful intellectual current that entered Auden's life, and we will discuss that in the next lecture. Thank you.